The smell of oil, metal, and fear filled the air. The sun hung low over the North African desert, a glowing furnace that turned everything it touched to dust and fire. Inside a British Crusader tank, Private Arthur Mac McAllister stared at the trembling metal walls, listening to the faint hum of the engine. His lips were dry, his hands trembling. He looked down, a dented tin mug in his palm and a wisp of steam curling upward. A cup of tea. It seemed absurd, even suicidal, to make tea in the middle of a battlefield. But to men like Mac, it wasn't just tea. It was sanity. It was home. It was a lifeline. Across the front lines, German tank crews moved with mechanical precision. They had better machines, more training, and the confidence of recent victories. But the British crews, exhausted, sweating in stifling 130-degree heat, had something else, something no manual could teach. They carried the stubborn, quiet defiance of men who refused to surrender their humanity, even inside a steel coffin. The idea that tea could save lives might sound like a joke, but in World War II it became a reality written in sweat, sand, and shrapnel. Because when the British Army went to war, it didn't just bring rifles and rations. It brought its most sacred weapon, the kettle. But this strange ritual didn't begin in the desert. It had roots stretching back to the very first days of the war. September 1939, Britain declares war on Nazi Germany. The Empire rallies its forces. Men from London, Liverpool, Glasgow, Bombay, Nairobi, Sydney. A world united under one flag, marching toward the unknown. In the early days, British tanks were primitive by later standards. Thin armor, unreliable engines, no air conditioning, just steel boxes baking under the sun. Inside, temperatures could exceed 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The men sweated through their uniforms, their throats raw from dust. And yet, whenever there was a pause, a lull between chaos and battle, they would reach for their flasks, their little kettles, and make tea. Even as shells exploded in the distance, even as German aircraft buzzed overhead. Why? Because for the British soldier, tea wasn't just a drink, it was identity. Letters from the front lines tell the story vividly. One corporal wrote home from Egypt, "We're running low on water, petrol, and ammo, but as long as we've got tea, we're all right." Another, serving in Normandy in 1944, wrote, "We brew up before a fight, after a fight, and sometimes during one. It's the only thing that keeps us steady." By 1942, this habit was so common that even German intelligence reports noted it. Captured documents referred to British soldiers as tea addicts who refused to move until they had their brew. What the Germans didn't realize was that this obsession had an unexpected tactical value.
Meanwhile, in the desert, British tank crews of the famed 8th Army, the Desert Rats, were engaged in a brutal chess match with Rommel's Afrika Korps. Days of heat and tension. Then sudden, violent engagements, a storm of dust, fire, and death. The desert shimmered like an ocean of glass. The tanks crawled forward, their treads grinding against the sand like iron serpents. During these long, nerve-wracking lulls, tanks often sat stationary for hours, waiting for orders or visibility to clear. Crewmen, trapped inside their vehicles, couldn't risk leaving. Snipers were everywhere. So they brewed tea right there, using makeshift stoves built from spare shell casings and fuel. Sometimes they even heated water on the tank's engine block itself. It was risky. The faint smell of fuel and fire could give away their position. But soldiers said the risk was worth it. That one moment of warmth and normalcy helped them think clearly, steady their nerves, and stay alert. Because when fear and exhaustion eat away at your mind, even the smallest comfort can mean survival. Men like Mac, crouched over a boiling canteen, didn't know they were changing military history. But the Army High Command didn't see it that way. Not at first. Early in the war, officers complained that soldiers wasted time brewing tea, even during combat. One general famously shouted at his men, "We're fighting a war, not running a bloody tea shop." What he didn't understand was that a few minutes with a kettle could mean the difference between a panicked soldier and a calm, focused one. As the war went on, evidence began to mount. Reports from the front showed that tank crews who brewed tea during short halts often performed better in sudden attacks. They were more alert, made fewer mistakes, and responded faster to orders. A pattern was emerging. Tea wasn't slowing the army down, it was keeping it alive. By late 1943, the British Army began quietly adapting to this strange truth. Engineers and crewmen began experimenting with safer, built-in ways to make tea inside tanks. At first, it was improvised. Small fuel burners rigged next to the transmission, kettles attached to hot pipes. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected tragedy and a spark of ingenuity on a scorched battlefield in Tunisia. It was 1943, and Sergeant Harold or Dusty Miller was leading a Churchill tank platoon in the Tunisian hills. His unit had been under constant fire for hours. When a brief silence fell, Dusty told his men, "Right, lads, let's brew up before Jerry starts again." They poured what little water they had into a canteen, set it on a makeshift stove at the back of the tank, and waited. Then, a mortar shell slammed nearby. The fuel caught fire. In seconds, the back of the tank was a furnace. Dusty survived, but one man was severely burned. There had to be a safer way, a soldier's way. When he returned to Britain later that year, he described the problem to an army engineer. Together, they came up with a revolutionary idea, a built-in system for heating water inside the tank, using the engine's residual heat. It was simple, elegant, and safe. And by 1945-46, this concept evolved into one of the most unique military inventions of the war, the boiling vessel, or BV. This small metal unit would become standard in every British tank after World War II, a device that could boil water, heat rations, and make tea, all without ever leaving the safety of the vehicle. The boiling vessel saved countless lives, not just because it made tea, but because it kept crews inside their tanks, where they were protected from snipers and shrapnel. The British Army would later call it, only half-jokingly, the most important piece of equipment a tank ever had. But before the BV was official, before tea became a tactical tool, the crews had to survive the deadliest battles of the Desert War, armed nothing but courage, a kettle, and the will to live like human beings in an inhuman world. And it was here, in the burning sands of El Alamein, that tea would prove itself more powerful than anyone imagined. The North African desert, endless, brutal, and alive with fire. Tank crews crouched beside their vehicles, shielding their eyes as the orange haze swallowed up the horizon. Sweat pooled in their boots. The shimmering heat made everything dance on the horizon, even the shapes of the enemy. Inside those tanks, metal walls trapped the heat until it felt like the air itself could ignite. And yet, Every afternoon, when the guns fell silent for a moment, they brewed tea. That scent of boiled water and scorched metal became the unofficial perfume of Britain's tank corps. The desert could take their strength, their machines, even their friends, but never their tea. They fought not just against Rommel's elite Afrika Korps. Just months earlier, they'd been the same men who brewed tea in silence before battle, the same habit that now carried them through the Desert War. For the British Eighth Army, this ritual was more than comfort. It was survival. A soldier once wrote, "When you're miles from water, food, or hope, a cup of tea reminds you that you're still human." As the summer of 1942 scorched the dunes, that ritual met its greatest test, the Battle of Gazala. Tank engines coughed in the heat. Dust stung their eyes. Lieutenant Ernest Waller and his crew of 4 crouched beside their Grant tank, a battered giant covered in dents and desert grime. They'd been fighting for 16 hours straight, and now, in a rare moment of silence, they began to brew. Fight, pause, brew, regroup, advance. It became their rhythm, the heartbeat of desert warfare. But the desert didn't care for rituals. German Stuka screamed overhead. Waller's men, still near their tanks, scrambled inside as bombs fell around them. One shell struck nearby. Sand and shrapnel filled the air. When the dust settled, the kettle lay overturned, steam hissing weakly from the spout. Waller stared at it, then, quietly, he laughed. He picked it up, wiped the soot away, and set it back on the heat. "That cup of tea was the best I ever had," he'd later say. As the weeks went on, reports trickled back from the front lines. Morale was holding. Men were exhausted, but steady, and somehow, the ritual helped. One German soldier later wrote, "They stop fighting and make tea. It's madness, but it works." The Afrika Korps, famous for its precision, could never understand it, how something so small could keep the British unbreakable. By October 1942, at El Alamein, the Desert War reached its boiling point. The night before the battle, soldiers brewed their tea in silence. A faint kettle whistle echoes through the still air. The smell of petrol and dust mixed with the faint aroma of leaves steeping in tin mugs. Then, thunder. Artillery roared across the desert. Tanks crawled forward under sheets of flame. Radios crackled, orders shouted, engines screamed. And still, in moments between the chaos, a few soldiers reached for their kettles. That cup of tea, brewed at just the right moment, kept those men alive. Because it wasn't just warmth in their hands, it was memory, it was home. When dawn came, the Eighth Army advanced. Tank by tank, inch by inch, they pushed Rommel's forces back until the tide of the Desert War finally shifted for good. That was the moment many veterans would later recall. Not the victory, not the cheering, but the faint hiss of a kettle after the guns had gone silent. After El Alamein, even the officers understood. This wasn't just superstition, it was strategy. The British command never banned the brew-ups. Instead, they quietly encouraged them, recognizing that morale, too, was a weapon. As one commander remarked, "You can lose your rations, you can lose your ammo, but if you lose your tea, you've truly lost it all." As 1943 dawned, the war moved north, from the burning sands of Africa to the freezing mud of Italy. The tanks changed, the battlefields changed, but the ritual followed. The smell of tea, the hiss of the kettle, the moment of calm before the storm. It had become part of the British soldier's soul. Europe.
Gone were the dunes and dust of North Africa. Now the war moved north.
Now the war moved north, into the mud, fog, and ruins of Italy. The soldiers called it a different kind of hell. No sun, no sandstorms, only endless rain, shattered towns, and the stench of war, clinging to everything. And yet, even here, one ritual survived. In the bombed-out villages of Cassino, men crouched under tarps and tank hulls, shielding tiny flames from the wind. They brewed tea in mess tins blackened with soot. The water was muddy, the leaves stale, but it didn't matter, because for them, that cup was more than warmth. It was proof that they were still human. Private George McAllister, the same tank mechanic we met in North Africa, now found himself knee-deep in Italian mud. He wrote in his pocketbook, quote, "Same lads, different war. No sand this time, just mud, but the tea still saves us." End quote. His words would outlive him. As the campaign pushed north toward Rome, soldiers faced a new enemy: exhaustion. In Italy, the tanks froze at night, the fuel lines stiffened, the men's hands shook from cold, not fear, and still they found a way to boil water, using engine heat, makeshift burners, even flaming rags soaked in petrol. Commanders noticed it again. Morale stayed high where the kettles stayed hot. A captain once said, quote, "If the tea's still warm, the fight's not lost." End quote. By 1944, the British Army had learned something profound. They didn't just need better tanks. They needed tanks that could sustain the men inside them. The battlefield wasn't only fought in steel and gunfire. It was fought in comfort, endurance, and mind. And so, as the Eighth Army crossed into France, engineers began experimenting with an idea born from the desert and tested in the mud: a built-in boiling system inside every tank. It was called the boiling vessel, or simply the BV. The first prototypes appeared late in the war, around 1945. A small, metal box wired to the electrical system, it could safely heat water for tea or rations without open flames. For the first time in history, a tank crew could make tea inside their armored home, even while on the move. It was simple, ingenious, human. And it would become standard issue in every British tank from that day forward. The boiling vessel wasn't designed in a laboratory of luxury. It was born out of necessity, written in oil and blood, from the burning sands of El Alamein to the frozen fields of Normandy. Soldiers had proved one thing: morale could be engineered. D-Day, June 6, 1944. As British and Canadian tanks rolled onto the beaches of Normandy, a few crews carried small, jury-rigged kettles welded inside their hulls. It wasn't official yet, but it was the beginning. In the chaos of war, a whisper of steam rose from within a Sherman tank. One soldier later recalled, quote, "We were soaked, shaking, scared out of our minds. But then, in the middle of all that noise, someone poured me tea, and for a few seconds, I believed we might actually make it home." End quote. The boiling vessel would go on to define the culture of the British Army for decades. Even in modern Challenger and Warrior tanks, the same principle remains: a soldier can make tea in the middle of battle. When the war finally ended in 1945, The factories fell silent, and the soldiers returned home. But inside every British tank, one thing stayed: a small, humming box of metal that symbolized something far greater than convenience. It symbolized survival, humanity, and the belief that in the darkest moments of war, warmth could still exist. A cup of tea. It couldn't stop bullets. It couldn't end the war. But it could keep a man alive long enough to see peace again. The guns had gone silent. Europe lay in ruins, cities broken, nations exhausted, and men trying to remember what peace even sounded like. But in the workshops of British military engineers, something remarkable was happening. They weren't building tanks for conquest anymore. They were building machines for survival. And among the blueprints, the new engines, and the redesigned armor, one small detail kept returning to every design table: a tiny metal box, barely larger than a loaf of bread. The boiling vessel. At first it seemed trivial, almost laughable, a device for tea after 6 years of devastation. But to the men who had lived inside those armored beasts, it was everything. Because they remembered. They remembered the desert heat, the freezing nights, the days when boiling water meant risking your life. The engineers listened. They had fought too. And so, the boiling vessel became more than an accessory. It became a symbol of how deeply the war had changed the British soldier, and how that soldier had changed British engineering itself. By 1946, as the British Army began modernizing its armored divisions, the BV was officially integrated into every new tank design. From the Centurion to the Chieftain, and later the Challenger, every machine carried it, the heartbeat of the crew's morale. Inside those cold steel chambers, it was more than warmth. It was ritual. It was home. Veterans would later joke that the BV was the most important piece of kit ever fitted to a British tank. Not the gun, not the armor, the kettle. Because for them, the war had proven a truth few armies understood: that endurance was not only physical, it was spiritual. A soldier who could make tea could make it through anything. Letters from veterans of Korea and later the Falklands often mentioned it. One corporal wrote in 1982, "The old Centurion was cold as death, but when the BV kicked in and we brewed our first cup, it felt like the war had stopped for a minute." The BV became a quiet legend, the unsung hero of British design. Every crew had their own traditions: strong black tea before dawn patrols, milk powder and sugar after a firefight, and when a comrade fell, one cup poured quietly onto the earth in remembrance. No medals for that, no headlines, just ritual, born from survival. Even Churchill, long after the war, acknowledged Britain's relationship with tea as a matter of national defense. He wasn't wrong. During the war, the government had rationed fuel, meat, and clothing, but never tea. It wasn't luxury. It was necessity. By the 1950s, the BV had become so iconic that soldiers joked every tank was powered by petrol and kept running by tea. Military manuals began listing the boiling vessel right beside the gun cleaning kit. It wasn't a detail anymore. It was doctrine. And as Britain entered the long shadow of the Cold War, that little kettle followed its soldiers across the world, from the jungles of Malaysia to the snows of Norway, from peacekeeping missions to battlefields that would never make the news. Everywhere, the same sound echoed through the armor, the hiss of water turning to steam. A sound that meant safety, that meant warmth, that meant, for one more day, survival. The world had changed. New weapons, new enemies, new technologies. But inside the British tank, something remained sacred. Not the steel, not the gunfire, but the silence that came when the water boiled, and a soldier raised his tin mug to his lips, remembering every man who had done the same before him. From the sands of Al Alamein to the streets of Basra, the ritual continued. 70 years of soldiers, generations apart, united by a single act of humanity in the heart of war. The boiling vessel. A device so small, yet so powerful, that it became not just a part of British engineering, but a part of British identity itself. Wars end. Machines evolve. But as long as British soldiers climb into tanks, there will always be the sound of a kettle, reminding them who they are. War has always been about machines, engines, and gears of death. But for the British soldier, there was always another kind of machine, one made not of steel, but of spirit. It was fueled not by petrol, but by tea. The British soldier was unique. He could march for days, sleep in mud, eat cold rations, and still find a way to boil water. It wasn't stubbornness, it was identity. From the trenches of the Somme to the deserts of Africa, from Korea to Kosovo, one thing never changed. When the world around them collapsed, the British brewed. A sergeant once joked, "You can tell a Brit's still alive by the steam coming off his mug." It wasn't far from the truth. To the Americans, war meant cigarettes and coffee. To the Russians, vodka and black bread. But to the British, it meant a hot brew, even if the world was burning. Every battlefield had its small miracles. Sometimes it was a letter from home, sometimes a photo tucked into a helmet. But for the British tank crews, it was the hiss of boiling water. That sound was a heartbeat, a reminder that they were still human beings in a world built to destroy them. There was a saying among armored divisions, "A tank without tea is just a coffin with a gun." They weren't being dramatic. Inside those cramped steel beasts, men lived shoulder to shoulder, sweating, choking, sometimes praying. The air stank of fuel and fear. A single moment of calm, a shared mug, a bad joke, a laugh through cracked lips, could hold the whole crew together. And time after time, it did. Tea became the soldier's code, a symbol of control in a life that offered none. When chaos erupted, when orders failed, when radios went silent, the ritual stayed. "Right then, lads, let's have a brew." It was their reset button, a pause between life and death. In that small act, boiling water, pouring, passing mugs around, they found something no training manual could teach: discipline through peace.
Historians often say that Britain won its wars through logistics and strategy. But those who were there know another truth. It wasn't just weapons that kept the army moving. It was warmth. It was humor. It was tea. In 1951, a report from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers noted, "Field morale remains consistently high where crews have access to the boiling vessel. Observed reduction in fatigue and operational error." Even science confirmed what soldiers already knew. Morale was measurable,
and it tasted like hot tea. The BV became part of every soldier's story. Each scratch on its surface told a tale. A rushed brew under shell fire, a shared sip with an enemy prisoner, a final cup before dawn. Decades later, when veterans gathered in reunion halls, they didn't talk first about medals or battles. They talked about tea, about the mug that got them through, the friend who always brewed it strongest, the day they ran out of sugar and laughed about it anyway. To outsiders, it might seem absurd that an empire of war machines cared so much about something so small. But that was the secret to Britain's endurance. They fought wars not through hatred, but through habit. Not through rage, but through routine. And tea, in its calm defiance, became their quiet rebellion against the madness around them. In every army mess and every tank since 1945, that ritual continues. Young recruits still learn the same lesson from old sergeants. Clean your weapon, check your treads, and never, ever start a fight before you've had your tea. Because behind the humor lies truth, a truth forged through generations of men who found courage not in shouts, but in silence, and in steam rising from a dented metal cup. The British Army has changed. The world has changed. But that small act, that pause before battle, remains. And if you listen closely, even now, you can still hear it. The quiet hum of the boiling vessel, the whistle of survival, the heartbeat of the human machine. Perhaps that's the real secret of the British soldier, not just how he fights, but how he stays human while doing it. The war ended, but the tea never did. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Britain was exhausted, scarred, rationed, uncertain of its place in the world. Cities lay in ruins, families had been torn apart. And yet, in homes from Glasgow to Portsmouth, the same ritual continued. The sound of a kettle, the rhythm of pouring, the quiet moment before another day began. It was as if the entire nation had inherited the soldier's ritual, a daily ceremony of calm in the ruins of empire. For 6 years, men had survived by boiling water in the belly of tanks, by finding peace in a sip of warmth amid chaos. Now they brought that ritual home. They taught it to their children. They built their lives around it. The tea break became more than habit. It became a symbol of survival. In the factories rebuilding Britain, foremen called it the breather. At 10:30 a.m., machines stopped, hands were wiped, and cups were lifted. No orders, no speeches, just steam rising into the cold air of industrial halls. It was the same steam that once drifted from Cromwell tanks in Normandy. Different war, different field, same meaning. By the 1950s, the tea break had become an institution. The Ministry of Labor even recognized it as an official part of the working day. What began as a battlefield survival tool had become a cornerstone of civilian life, a pause that defined the rhythm of post-war Britain. Sociologists later noted, no other nation ritualized rest like Britain did after 1945. The tea break became a cultural echo of wartime endurance. In every cup, there was memory. Memory of comrades lost, of laughter shared under fire, of the simple joy of warmth in a cold world. For many veterans, tea wasn't just a drink. It was therapy. When words failed, the kettle spoke for them. A widow in Liverpool once said, "My husband never talked about the war, but every morning when he made his tea, he stared out the window like he was remembering something only the steam could show him." There are millions of stories like hers, small, quiet, but powerful. Britain's economy crawled forward, fueled not just by coal and steel, but by morale. And morale had a flavor: tannin, milk, and a spoon of sugar when you could find it. Tea was rationed until 1952, but even then no one dared to skip it. People would share leaves, re-steep, improvise. The ritual mattered more than the ingredient. The BV too evolved. As the British Army modernized its vehicles, from Centurion to Chieftain to Challenger, the BV remained. Each new generation of tank inherited that small, stubborn piece of tradition. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about memory, a silent nod to the men who brewed before them. Every crew knew, this isn't just a machine. It's a lifeline. A reminder that beneath the armor, we are still men. By the 1960s, as Britain transformed from empire to modern state, tea went with it, into offices, living rooms, schools, and even protests. When miners struck, they carried flasks. When students marched, someone always had a thermos. When grief struck, as it so often did in the decades after the war, tea became the first response. Before anger, before tears, before action, there was always tea.
In many ways, the boiling vessel had created more than just a convenience. It had shaped a culture, one that believed in composure, calm, and quiet defiance. The same composure that kept a crew alive under bombardment now kept a family together during rationing. The same patience that boiled water in a tank now built homes, schools, and industries out of rubble. Tea wasn't escapism. It was resilience, liquid courage, a small rebellion against despair. There's a photograph taken in 1946, a British tank parked in a Berlin street. On its hull, 5 soldiers sit, boots muddy, uniforms torn. Between them sits a small tin kettle, steam curling into the cold German air. One of them holds a mug, smiling. That photograph says everything. It isn't about victory or flags or politics. It's about survival with grace, about finding warmth in the ruins and carrying that warmth home to rebuild a nation. In that sense, the story of the British tank and its tea isn't just a story of war. It's the story of a people, how they endured, how they adapted, and how they turned the simplest ritual in the world into a symbol of strength. Every nation has its anthem. Britain had a kettle. In the end, tea didn't just save lives, it shaped them. The legacy of steam carried on, from battlefield to home front, from survival to tradition, from war to peace. And perhaps that's the truest mark of civilization, to find comfort not in power, but in warmth. War has always been a paradox of destruction and invention. Every weapon built, every defense designed, carries within it a spark of human creativity. And sometimes that creativity doesn't come from scientists or generals, but from a soldier craving a cup of tea. In 1945, as Britain began rebuilding its industries, military engineers gathered in small, smoke-filled rooms. Their mission? To design the next generation of British armored vehicles. The lessons of the desert were still fresh, the heat, the isolation, the endless waiting. And among all the technical debriefs and performance charts, one note stood out. Crew survival and efficiency improved when hot beverages were available. It was a small observation, but to British engineers, it was a revelation. At the Fighting Vehicle Research and Development Establishment in Chertsey, a quiet proposal appeared in 1946. BV, boiling vessel, to be made standard equipment in all armored vehicles.
For the first time in history, a national army formally institutionalized comfort as a combat requirement. It wasn't about luxury, it was about endurance. Morale had become measurable, and the kettle a tactical instrument. The BV allows crews to prepare hot tea, soup, or sterilized water without leaving the safety of their vehicle. The narrator's voice was calm, factual, but behind the words lay something profound. Britain had weaponized warmth. The first standardized BV appeared in the Centurion tank. Compact, rugged, self-sealed. It could heat water from the tank's electrical system, withstand shell shock, and still brew tea at 30,000 feet of altitude or in the freezing cold of Norway. Other nations took notice and laughed. The Americans joked, "The Brits don't fight without a teapot." The Germans quipped, "Leave it to the English to make war civilized." But what began as a joke soon became envy. When NATO trials compared crew endurance across long missions, British tank crews consistently outperformed others in alertness and morale. The reason wasn't just training, it was comfort. A warm drink meant stable nerves, slower fatigue, and a sense of humanity inside a machine built for destruction.
The boiling vessel became a case study in psychological warfare, not against the enemy, but against despair. The Ministry of Defense quietly commissioned reports how minor comforts sustained soldiers under extreme duress, how small rituals reduced post-combat trauma. They found something remarkable. The act of brewing tea itself had a stabilizing effect on the nervous system. The sound of boiling water, the repetitive motions, the smell. It created order amid chaos, a momentary illusion of home. For many soldiers, that illusion meant survival. When the shelling starts, I focus on the kettle. It's stupid maybe, but if I can make tea, then I'm still alive. That line was later used in psychological resilience training manuals, decades ahead of its time. By the 1980s, the boiling vessel had become legendary among NATO forces. American and French crews unofficially began installing makeshift versions in their vehicles. The British, of course, never removed theirs. It was a matter of identity now. In Challenger tanks, Britain's pride, the BV was still there, humming quietly, still powered by the main battery. In fact, every modern British armored vehicle, from troop carriers to reconnaissance units, includes one to this day. Even in the 21st century, under the searing heat of Basra or the dust of Helmand, the kettle's legacy lives on. Footage shows soldiers pouring steaming tea into metal mugs, smiling amid the dust. Different war, same ritual. You don't fight better because of tea, one modern crewman said. You fight longer. Few inventions have bridged generations like this, from the sand dunes of Africa to the deserts of Iraq. The BV has survived longer than many of the tanks it served in. It outlasted wars, governments, even empires. And through it all, it carried one unspoken truth. Comfort is not weakness, it's strength refined by compassion. The British military didn't just design a machine, they designed a philosophy. That even in the worst of humanity's inventions, there must remain a place for humanity itself. A small metal vessel, a handful of tea leaves, a habit turned heritage. From the trenches to the tanks, from the battlefield to the break room. The story of Britain's boiling vessel isn't really about tea at all. It's about the endurance of civility in a world of chaos, the courage to care, the engineering of empathy.
And it all began with a soldier who refused to fight on an empty cup. They say victory belongs to those who endure. Perhaps that endurance was forged, one kettle at a time. It's decades after the war now. London has rebuilt. The sand that once clung to uniforms has long since washed away. But somewhere, in kitchens, in barracks, in factories, the same sound returns. That soft, rising whistle. The sound of calm. The sound of home. The war ended, but the ritual never did. In every era since, Korea, the Falklands, Iraq, Afghanistan, the British soldier's day still begins and ends with the same tradition. It's not superstition, it's identity. The boiling vessel became more than a piece of metal. It became a bridge between past and present, hardship and humanity. When a Challenger crew brews tea in a war zone, they're repeating the same gesture as their grandfathers in El Alamein. The same pause before chaos, the same defiance against fear. Tea, ladies and gentlemen, the nation's comfort. That line once played over the airwaves in 1940, a simple message to keep spirits alive during the Blitz. Back then, tea was rationed, guarded as fiercely as ammunition. Every drop mattered, because every drop reminded people what they were fighting for. Even Hitler's bombs couldn't stop the kettle. When gas lines broke, people brewed under candles. When the power failed, they used camp stoves. It wasn't about taste, it was about continuity. The reassurance that the world, though cracked and burning, still had small corners of peace. Historians often say the Allies won because of superior industry, resources, and intelligence. But those who fought knew victory also depended on spirit. And spirit was often measured in moments like these: a shared mug, a quiet word, the brief illusion of normalcy in a collapsing world. Today, Britain is no longer an empire. Its tanks are fewer, its wars more distant, but its rituals remain. Tea in Parliament, tea in protests, tea in grief and in joy. It's not just a drink, it's an inheritance. The same steam that rose above desert tanks now curls above London rooftops and Yorkshire kitchens. It carries the scent of survival, of civility forged in fire. A reminder that history doesn't just live in museums or medals. It lives in the everyday things we never let go of. To the lads who never came back, one veteran once said, I still brew one for them every morning. The steam rises the same way it always did, light catching in the air like memory. A symbol that outlasted war, outlasted empires, outlasted fear. Because in the end, the story of British tea in World War II wasn't really about tea. It was about the human need to remain human, even in hell. The fire burned cities, the world changed, but the steam never died. From the sands of North Africa to the steel of the modern battlefield, the boiling vessel remains, a small machine born from war, sustained by tradition, and forever powered by the quiet endurance of those who refuse to give up their humanity.